we're wrapping up part one of Pyrrhus Cineas by Simone de Beauvoir. That humanities section is, I think, really interesting because it introduces some themes that Beauvoir is going to talk a lot about in material published later, like The Ethics of Ambiguity and other things. So we saw that you can't shrink yourself down into the instant. You can't think of just living here and now, focused on the present moment, and withdraw into yourself to become a sort of passive observer of the world around you. We saw that inevitably you get pulled sort of back into your particular project. Likewise, you cannot sort of expand yourself out. You can't go in the other direction and try to make yourself into this infinitely connected being, because then all of your particular projects that give your life meaning and structure your life lose all of their importance. You're emptied of all of your specific content, and you become sort of a merely formal relation to all of the things in the world. If you love everybody the same, then your love for your family or friends or whatever loses its particular flavor and value as love for this person. It gets all sort of washed out in your projection to the infinite. God, in some ways, was trying to synthesize these two because God posits an infinite being toward whom humans transcend. But there are various problems with our conceptual, our concept of God. But again, going back to the existentialist theory of consciousness that Beauvoir is basically sort of working with, I end up founding God as an object of my consciousness. I end up having to make decisions about the meaning of God, how I stand in that relationship, and so on and so forth. And so I still am not able to glean my life's meaning from this relationship because I still have to act and make decisions and found it. I have to decide to believe in God, that the voice I hear is God's, how to interpret the Word of God, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a temptation then to say, well, okay, let's just focus on here. Let's return to earthly things and focus on humanity. Beauvoir recognizes that when we talk about sort of a universal humanity, we risk many of the same problems, because now we're talking again about an abstraction. And even though Beauvoir politically thinks it's important to have solidarity among groups, you know, political solidarity is significant for her, there's this kind of mythological element of solidarity with all humanity, again because it empties us of these particularities, and it's the particularities that we discover in our concrete relationships that really give our life meaning. It's why we get out of bed in the morning. We get out of bed in the morning to do specific things, to pursue specific projects that are important to us, to which we've committed. And sometimes from the outside you can describe all of this in a sort of absurd way. Oh, you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth and you go to work and you come home and you go to bed, and you get up and you brush your teeth and you go to work and you come home and you go to bed, and you get up and you brush your teeth and you go to work and you come home and you go to bed. But that, again, is just an external view that destroys or overlooks any of what it is like to do those things, the reasons why you do those things, which are different for everyone, and that's what really grounds people in their actions, rather than some sort of impartial outside view. So we can do the same thing with humanity, and there's a few really sort of poignant sections in the humanity part, right? She says, for instance, so I mentioned in the last video that humanity takes this form, the abstract form of general humanity. It takes that form in the myth of solidarity, and then we think of ourselves just as cogs in the machine, as playing some replaceable part. But of course, there's no such place just waiting for us, marked out ahead of time. We come first, she says, and then we have to make sort of our way in the world. She starts to do some sort of cultural and some of her political inclinations come up in this section. For instance, she uses the example, and the young man encounters even more precise appeals around him. Each year a certain number of government workers, doctors, fitters are needed. The world lacks manpower. He can slip into one of these voids, but there is never one that is molded exactly for him. Again, when we think of something like human resources, or that labor power is needed, any laborer can fulfill that. They're not valued for who they are in their particularity. Their projects, why they might need work to support their family, to send money home to a loved one, so that they're saving up to buy a house. None of that is present in just the people have jobs sort of like thing, or there are jobs for people to do. So I talked a little bit about that in the last video. She talks that there's no pre-established harmony. All of this negotiation between us is attempting to establish something like a harmony, or not, as different people see it, right? She says that wars, unemployment, crises plainly show that there doesn't exist any pre-established harmony between men. Initially, men do not depend on one another because initially they are not, they have to be. Freedoms are neither unified nor opposed, but separated. In projecting himself into the world, a man situates himself by situating other men around him. So solidarities are created, but man cannot enter into solidarity with all the others because they do not all choose the same goals, since their choices are free. If I serve the proletariat, I combat capitalism. The soldier only defends his country by killing its adversaries. This is a theme that will be picked up in the ethics of ambiguity, specifically talking about like the antinomies of reason. There's an interpretation of existentialism where the existence among human beings is kind of combative, where it's like a struggle between subjective wills trying to actualize their projects. I think the passage that I just read there in Beauvoir is a kind of a strong statement against that interpretation, that, again, the existentialists can't really view humanity as being fundamentally opposed in struggle or whatever. Those are contingent facts. Struggles and the like are contingent facts that arise out of the existence of humanity in concert with one another. But there's nothing like inherently or necessarily combative, what would you say? There's nothing necessarily opposed between us. It doesn't have to be combative. I don't think that's the word I'm looking for, but anyway. It doesn't sound right in my ear, but we don't have to be against each other or for each other or anything like that. We establish those relations sort of through living. So I hear this a lot, that, oh, existentialists think there's this struggle between everybody, we can't reconcile, our freedoms are opposed, and that kind of thing. Yes, I think that that is an element of the existential analysis. We have to be able to account for how we come into conflict with one another. But I don't think that human relationships are necessarily in contest with one another and I think that passage, she says, freedoms are neither unified or opposed. So you situate yourself by situating other people around you. So, anyway, that's a very interesting and significant point. Now, there's an important qualification that just because there's no necessary struggle between individuals, certain individuals will come into conflict with one another because of the way that our projects sort of oppose. It's not all, at least given the current arrangement of society and the evidence of history, we can't avoid situations in which our interests are in opposition to other people. This is just basic sort of social living and conflict that arises therein, right? So our relationships aren't necessarily determined to be a struggle against one another. But inevitably, certain specific struggles between individuals will arise because of our different projects in the world. And that's a little bit further down on page 108 there. She begins to sort of talk about Hegel, and we get a back sort of a reference, or an oblique reference back to the very beginning. Remember, Pyrrhus's project is one of conquest, and she talks about this desire to want it all. But again, we're butting up into the problem of trying to live in the realm of abstractions, right? That if you want it all, you want everything. There again, that is losing the sense of particularity, right? She says, sheltered in the unique and impassive heaven, the wise man would see revolutions pass by like shadows on the eternally changing face of earth. He would not lift a finger to secure the triumph of a certain shape of the world which will be erased tomorrow. So all humanity is invested in bringing into existence a certain world in which it can find its place, in which it can situate itself. So we all have sort of particular desires to see the world turn out in a certain way, to see this person win for president, the presidential election, to see this coalition come into power in government, to see certain things happening in our community that we can preserve the environment, or establish like a park for the community, or whatever the case may be, have a bagged lunch program for the kids or in the neighborhood. Or we all want sort of very specific things in our world to come about for our own sort of human interests. We want to see certain sort of effects being brought about in the world. We don't want to accomplish just sort of everything. We don't just have a general sort of abstract vision of, oh, I want to make the world better. No, we have a specific vision about what better is and what that would entail, and so on and so forth. And we don't view it indifferently, right? She says, the optimistic economist of the 19th century admires overpopulation for bringing an excess of labor and a correlative decrease in salaries, which leads to the mortality and sterility of the working class, thus leading back to depopulation and so forth. So again, this sort of cold and calculating view of human beings in the abstract that doesn't consider them in their sort of particularities, that views them merely as like human resources, cogs that can be fit into any sort of machine. And so we think of depopulation and mortality rates, but we don't think of that those are people dying with real, like, specific people. It's your relative or somebody's relative or friend or whatever the case may be. And she says that that's floating in a Hegelian ether. Neither life nor the death of these particular men seem important to us. And so all of this is just subsuming everything down into one sort of particular end. So this is the same thing that happens with the messianic narrative in the God section, right? That becomes the whole, when she's talking about Claudel, that becomes the whole narrative. And so everything is good or has meaning only insofar as it's useful for one task. When we turn to humanity, humanity might project certain projects in the abstract, but it becomes the same sort of problem. Everything is reduced to the use value of, will it help me fulfill this goal? We'll see a lot of criticism. She criticizes both fascism and Marxism for the way that they valorize a kind of history and use history to establish a transcendent value. Now, the transcendent value, the particularities of that abstract value are vastly different in Marxism and fascism, right? They're opposed to one another, diametrically opposed in certain ways. But the basic idea of history being the bearer of this absolute value that comes somewhat external, it's a transcendental source of meaning for human beings living here and now that arrives from the past. That's a similar thing. We'll talk about that more with the ethics of ambiguity. But this is the sort of the problem with human projects, whether it's towing the party line or joining a church or religion or your career. we want to project these values into a transcendent absolute, and therefore we don't have to take the responsibility for founding them in their particularity and justifying this project as opposed to some other project. And people will often sort of talk on the level of abstraction and generality exactly so that they don't have to like meet those challenges and those questions sort of head on, right? It's just, this is a good passage on page 112 that speaks to this, right? The universal spirit does not rejoice over this machinery. The bourgeois economist does. The universal spirit is voiceless, and every man who claims to speak its name only lends his own voice. So there is that claim. Again, people try to recover their failed projects through this, they try to recover their failed projects by merging them with this transcendent value. So they say, well, I may have failed and stumbled, but I'm actually lending myself to this grand cause or to this great thing, right? So it's, again, it's one way to sort of avoid these responsibilities and having to justify the particular choices that I make, having to justify my own failure. If my failure is part of this grand transcendental scheme, then I'm still forwarding something. My failure doesn't seem as bad because I'm making efforts toward this grand narrative. Now, part of the problem, and this is what she says at the bottom of 112, closing up that section on humanity, one claims that every end can be seen as a means toward an end that is farther off. One denies that anything is really an end. The project is emptied of all its contents. Man finds himself plunged in the heart of an expanse of equal indifference, where things are what they are, without him ever choosing to make them be. So again, by submerging ourselves into this grand sort of narrative, everything becomes subservient to it, and all the particularities are emptied in favor of this one sort of abstract universal. And so nothing means anything for what I'm doing for this particular project. It's the whole problem of the you go up just to come back down again. By framing it in just this big perpetual movement, you lose sort of everything. You lose all sort of concrete and particular content. That's why she finds the situation so important to turn to here, right? She says, therefore, Candide's garden can be neither reduced to an atom nor merged with the universe. Man is only by choosing himself. If he refuses to choose, he annihilates himself. The paradox of the human condition is that every end can be surpassed, and yet the project defines the end as an end. In order to surpass an end, it must first have been projected as something that is not to be surpassed. So we project the end as a finality, as something that won't be surpassed. But of course, it is. When we get there, that particular chapter, that particular door is closed, but then the other thing opens. So there is a kind of finality to the end of any particular act that we want to go about. But it plays that double game, right? That ambiguity of being both a beginning and an end. So there's a finality to it in reference to this specific content, and yet this specific content will become surpassed, and therefore its end, which is posited as absolute, ultimately ends up being surpassed anyway. Again, that ambiguity that she had introduced before is important there. Here again, our finitude becomes a big strength for the existentialist. She says that it's not that we endure our finitude, but we actually desire it, because we desire the particularity. She sort of goes against Heidegger here, because for Heidegger, death is my own most possibility. It's the thing that most sort of defines me. I have to die my death. No one else can do it. She says that death does not have that importance, which has often been endowed. It is not because man dies that he is finite. Our transcendence is always concretely defined on this side of death or beyond it. So Beauvoir is not granting death this strong sort of individualizing mark of finitude. We're always being individualized each time we're making decisions and engaged in certain things. Our whole being is one of individualizing ourselves and our actions, right? Pyrrhus doesn't wait to have traveled around the world to return home. The revolutionary worries little about no longer being there the day that the revolution triumphs. The limit of our undertaking is at its very heart, not outside of it. A man makes a trip. He hurries to arrive in Lyon that evening because he wants to be in Valence tomorrow in order to be in Montélimar, the day after tomorrow in Avignon, the day after that in Arles, the following day, so on. Someone might laugh at him from the outside, but it doesn't matter to him. He will have taken the projected trip, his trip, right? That's what she says. Again, kind of our rock is our thing, our particularities. So she says explicitly on 114 that this is against Heidegger, that death is our essential end. There's no other choice than the flight or the assumption of this ultimate possibility. So she has a more nuanced discussion when she brings Heidegger explicitly into it. So she rejects the death as our definitive project, as our own most possibility for being. But she is somewhat in agreement that we are actualized through an engagement with an objective world. So she's finding some sort of middle ground with Heidegger there. But she actually thinks that this point refutes Heidegger's own conclusion. So she's pointing out sort of an inconsistency in Heidegger here, and pulling her view, distinguishing her view a little bit from the Heideggerian position, especially shifting that emphasis away from death, right? She says Heidegger agrees that compared to other ends, the supreme end is not defined as an end by any act. Death, the supreme end, right? The resolute decision that throws man toward his death does not lead him to kill himself, but only to live in the presence of the death. But what is this presence? It is nowhere else than in the act that presence is. It realized only in the creation of concrete links. Thus, the Heideggerian conversion is shown to be as ineffective as the Stoic conversion. As before, life continues, identical. It is only a matter of an interior change. So again, Beauvoir is pointing out that what Heidegger is really talking about from her perspective is how we orient ourselves toward death, how we think about and how we live our finitude in relation to that. So it's not so much that we choose death or that we set death as an end and that death follows as an end from an act, which is what ends are for Beauvoir, much more strongly than in Heidegger, because there's much more explicit focus on that intentional structure of consciousness, where Heidegger doesn't even really talk about, he avoids the word consciousness really at all cost. And he doesn't really talk about intentionality explicitly unless he's doing historical analysis, like in the lecture, The Basic Problems of Phenomenology or something like that. Whereas Beauvoir has taken all of that on much more explicitly. So ends are related to sort of acts and things that I will to do and so on. And if death doesn't come about that way, then death becomes merely an intentional object that I can bring into my own presence by thinking about it in a certain way, which means what is of importance is how I undertake my life in the face of my death, how I think, how I relate to it, what I choose to do in the face of that. And again, there's this irony that she talks again about Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, that immortality doesn't really, there's a sort of irony to it, she says. Even though I would be immortal, even though I would try to identify myself with immortal humanity, every end would remain a departure, every surpassing an object to surpass, and that in this game of relationships there is no other absolute. No other absolute than the totality of these very relationships emerging from the void. without support. You are without reason, without end. But, and then here she references Sartre. So she's bringing Sartre into the discussion sort of to play them against Heidegger. Man's being is not the fixed being of things. You have to be your being, and so you have to make yourself, you have to choose your project, and so on. These kinds of scholarly discussions in the text are important because both Beauvoir and Sartre needed to sort of distinguish themselves from Heidegger. Heidegger's influence is very clear in existentialism, and Sartre had spent time studying in Germany, particularly Husserl's phenomenology, but at the time, you know, Heidegger was kind of up and coming. Being in Time was published in 1927. It was very well known. It had been translated into French, and so the French translation of Being in Time is cited throughout Being in Nothingness. But Sartre and Beauvoir are not content with being viewed as like Heideggerians or a disciple of Heidegger. They find a lot of inspiration in him, but they also are keen to distinguish themselves for a lot of reasons, philosophical reasons, but also political reasons. I mean, Heidegger's a Nazi, so you can't fight, you can't live under Nazi occupation for 4 years and be a pretty strident anti-fascist and then feel like great about just taking on uncritically Heidegger's philosophy. So these kind of interventions are historically important for distinguishing existentialism from Heidegger's version of phenomenology. Heidegger, I don't consider Heidegger to be an existentialist. I think that's sort of historically, and I think he deals with existential themes, but existentialism, from my view proper, is really a Sartre, Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty thing that then gets continued and extended into various areas after the 1940s. So a lot of people have existential concerns, but existentialism sort of takes shape as a particular theoretical stance in the 1940s, and then kind of blossoms from there, and other people pick it up and adopt it. We'll talk about Frans Fanon and the important, you know, anti-colonial and post-colonial analyses, the influence in feminism and critical race theory, and that kind of stuff. We'll talk much more about later. So. Yeah, I don't think Heidegger himself is really, and he denies being an existentialist. Dealing with existential themes, certainly, kind of a fellow traveler when it comes to certain theses, perhaps even that existence precedes essence, which is probably the core philosophical claim of existentialism. But doing other things in terms of like the transcendental importance of being, the role of history and determining meaning and value and things like that, I think are outside the realm of metaphysical acceptability. I don't think Sartre or Beauvoir would accept some of those things for various reasons. So Beauvoir here closes up. We have arrived at the conclusion that the project is singular and therefore finite. The temporal dimension of transcendence is not desired for itself. It depends upon the nature of the founded object. So we all have our particular projects, our particular situation that helps us to define those projects. So remember, this section was called The Situation, and we all find ourselves in a particular concrete situation with this particular past, among these particular people, and so on. Now those provide us with certain sort of limiting factors. We have to find our place there, but they don't determine us out of like a kind of causal necessity. We can work to change and rearrange and renegotiate those things among other people. So the situation will become a much more significant concept and a theme. But in order to be free, I have to be situated. I can't enact my freedom in the abstract. My life doesn't mean anything without the situation that particularizes it. Now remember, going back to this existential theory of consciousness, being for itself as conscious depends upon the object of which it is conscious. So the object is there first, and then consciousness brings it into presence, right? It makes it be an object for consciousness. But without the object of which it becomes conscious, consciousness doesn't happen, right? There's being first, and then the negation or the nothingness of that being in consciousness taking distance from it in order to make it appear present. So you need the situation in order to take on your particular project and engagement. Without it, you don't get any of that. You can't just act in a void. You need something to act on, a situation to act in, particular things to sort of like grasp onto, to project your meaning onto, to involve yourself with in various projects and amongst other people. That's the very last thing she says, the last line in that situation section, but man is not alone in the world. That is the end of part one. And that is sort of a resounding closure to the first part of this essay. Pyrrhus and Cineas are together. The people in Candide's garden are tending their garden, but they're tending it sort of together, right? So the next part is going to lean into this and explore this relationship with others much more thoroughly. Because part of being in a situation is being among other people who have in part determined the situation a little bit ahead of time. You learn social rules from other people, you're conditioned by, family and society, school, religious institutions and things like that, to take on certain values, and things take a certain sort of meaning because they're being negotiated with you throughout childhood and into your adolescence until you start to sort of really, take over the responsibility that your freedom puts on you. So you're always sort of in the world among other people, and it's really important that we recognize that's an irreducible element. The other is always there sort of for me. I'm never, remember, this is the whole point of the instant. You're not some atomized, isolated individual. You're not infinitely connected to everyone everywhere either, but you are concretely connected to other individuals sort of from the start. Your existence sort of presupposes the existence of others. So in a way, in existential, I don't think they really take like the problem of other minds seriously or anything like that. I don't think that is a real problem in existentialism. They would view that, I think, as a kind of philosophical sophistry, right? Solipsism, problem of other minds. These are very clever philosophical issues that clever people think about, and they're very smart. But they're just that. They're just an intellectual game. It's just, but that's the whole reality of our existence just screams against these, problems. So in terms of like existential analysis, I think Beauvoir and Sartre treats solipsism and being and nothingness, but I don't think they really hold them to be plausible philosophical positions at all. Okay, here we are, among other people. We will pick up with part 2 and move on in these series of videos about Pyrrhus and Cineas.